To use the ampersand local scope property, we could simply come into our isolate scope area of our directive and we can give it a property name. Now I'm going to call this action as we saw earlier, and then we simply put ampersand. And that'll add it in and we're kind of ready to go there. Now where this is useful is if a function is assigned to this, then I could actually invoke this, which would in turn invoke the function. So we could come, for instance, onto this button and say when it's clicked, let's go ahead and call the action property. Now this works out really well because now I don't know what's going to be called. I'm really just allowing the user of my directive, which is called isolate scope with event here, to pass me in a function. I'm going to go ahead and store it in action, and then we can simply invoke action right here. All right, so let's take a look in our page that uses this. Let's come on in and we'll do another area here for this. We'll say isolate scope with event. And now we're going to go ahead and use this one. So we'll do isolate scope with event. Now we need to define what is the action that gets called. And we have some unknown that goes right there. Well, if I come back up to the controller that's actually bound into this, we have a few things that are in here. We have an add customer, which just logs and pushes into an array. We have a change data, which actually changes the customer. So you'll notice that right now the customer is David and 1234 Anywhere Street. Well, when change data gets called, then it's James and some counter Cedar Point Street. So let's go ahead and use this change data and see how we can pass that in. So because the controller scope applies to all of these, we can now pass in our change data. That will now be stored in the action in the directive. And action now represents change data. So it's kind of, I think of it as an alias. And then when the button is clicked, we simply invoke it, which then invokes the alias. And that's kind of how it works. So let's go ahead and add the script in here. And we need the event directive. All right, and we should be ready to go. So let me switch back over to the browser. Let's refresh. And okay, so name and street did not show up, so we have a little problem there, of course. But let's try change data. And you'll see that it indeed worked. Now, of course, the reason that the other piece didn't work is I forgot to add the data source. So we'll do data source equals customer. Let's go ahead and wrap this down so you can see the whole thing. And there we go. Let's switch back over to the browser here, refresh it, and there we go. So now we have the data. You can see it's the same data that we have all the way up here, but when we hit change data, that's gonna then fire that change data function. That then changes the customer property, which affects all of these because it's passed into all these directives. And you can see that everything now changes to James and Cedar Point Street. And then there's a little counter. If I keep hitting it, you'll see it, the counter kind of increments here. And so that is how we can actually notify the outside world across the wall, if you will, that, hey, something changed. And this is really useful because you might have a little directive that it gets the data and maybe it updates it through a two-way binding with the equals property, but you want to know when they're officially done. You want like a save button. Well, when they click it, now you know how you could pass in a function, which acts as a callback function, hook that up to the save button in the directive, and then when it's clicked, as with the change data, you can invoke some type of outer function, some callback function. And that's an example of using the ampersand local scope property.